This is Protea, one of the best Warframes ever created. She deals incredible damage, is very survivable, can be used in many different scenarios, and she likes to juggle balls in her hand. Yes, I just really said that. Anyway, even though she's already a massive powerhouse, throughout 2025, we've gotten quite a few upgrades that indirectly buff her and make Protea even stronger. So, in this Warframe guide, I'm gonna give you the ultimate 2026 Protea breakdown with multiple updated builds and everything. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and let's go! But you know the drill. First of all, let's talk about her abilities, starting out with the passive, and this one is actually pretty simple and straightforward, but very strong. I would even go so far to say probably one of the best in the game. For every 4th ability cast, Protea will get plus 100% ability strength. This is additive, meaning it kinda sorta functions as if you have a free blind rage for every 4th cast. To keep track of which ability will be the one that gets buffed, there is a little meter in the bottom right corner of your screen that counts your ability cast and showcases you when you are ready. All in all, this passive is absolutely amazing, especially because many abilities in the game snapshot ability strength, and it not only works on her kit, but also on any subsumed helmet ability. So yeah, that roar, well, that's gonna give you quite the damage bonus. Ability number 1 is called Grenade Fan, and with this one, Protea can throw out 2 different kinds of grenades. If you tap the ability button, you will throw out Shrapnel Vortex grenades, and if you hold it, you will get Shield Satellite ones. We're gonna go over what exactly they do in just a second. Only one thing I wanted to mention here, you can go into the options menu and switch the tap and hold function if that is more comfortable for you. As for the grenades, for the Shrapnel Vortex ones, you throw out 3 grenades in front of you, and each one of them will create a small AoE globe around it, in which enemies take slash damage per second with a 33% status chance of inflicting bleed status. One thing that is very cool about this is that there's no line of sight check, so you can hit enemies through walls with this AoE, and if the enemy doesn't have overguard, they're also trapped in a constant loop of stagger as long as they are within the AoE of the grenade. All in all, these grenades don't deal that much damage at base, however they come in very handy in stationary defense situations because you can just spam them all over the battlefield to keep all the enemies around you trapped in a constant stagger loop, which will prevent them from attacking the defense target. And I'm not exaggerating here, this function alone makes Protea an excellent solo defense frame. I even finished multiple solo Archimedia runs just because of it. It's very good. And then the second type of grenades, that will be the Shield Satellite, and this one is your main tool of survivability. When you pick up one of these Shield Satellites, it will first restore a big flat amount of shields outright, and then on top of that, it will orbit around you for its entire duration, restoring shields per second depending on your ability strength. With high ability strength, this one will regenerate crazy amounts of shields. However, there is another great feature, and that is that when your shield breaks while you're under the influence of the shield orb, it will explode and double your shield gating invincibility duration. What that means in practice is, given that you're usually having high shields on Protea, you will almost always gain 5 seconds of full invincibility if your shields break. So if you spam a lot of those shield orbs all over the battlefield, you can instantly pick up another one and not die at all. Just one very important thing to mention here with the shield gating duration. On Protea, you ideally want to make sure to not use any augur mods or the mod Brief Respite, because while the shield orb will almost always give you 5 seconds of shield gating invincibility, if during that invincibility time frame you regain shields through the passive of the augur mod set or Brief Respite if you cast an ability, then this fat 5-second invincibility will be overwritten and cut short. That is ideally something you want to avoid, so better just don't use those mods on her. Skill number 2 is called Blaze Artillery, and oh boy, is this one of the highest damage dealing abilities in the game. If you tap the ability button, you will create a floating turret that will start shooting at enemies in a 130-degree cone in front of you, so it's not a 360 AoE. Each hit of the Blaze Artillery has infinite body punch through, meaning it can hit multiple enemies per shot, it deals heat damage, and it has a 100% status chance, so it will always also inflict a burning status effect. Now, the reason why I said that this skill is so incredibly high damage is that there is a multiplier that you will also see on the turret itself, which ticks up whenever the turret hits an enemy. And for each point of that multiplier, the Blaze Artillery will then increase its damage by 100%. So, in other words, if you had a 35 times multiplier on your turret, then that turret would deal 3,500% damage. And just to be clear here, this multiplier is not capped, so it can theoretically stack up infinitely, and it goes up for every single enemy hit. Remember, this turret has infinite body punch through. So, if you, let's say, group up 20 enemies in one blob, and then the turret hits all of them with one bullet, that means the multiplier will go up by 20 times per shot. It is absolutely crazy how high the damage scaling of this can be. Just as a little example, right here, these are Steel Path Juggernauts, some of the tankiest enemies in the game and barely crackable with any other weapon. However, the Blaze Artillery just keeps shooting them, scaling up the damage until they absolutely explode. It is crazy. Only downside here is that the duration of those turrets is very low, which is usually the thing preventing it from scaling all too high. But later when we get to the build section, we're gonna find some ways to extend this duration quite a bit. Now, Blaze Artillery also has an augment called Temporal Artillery, but I don't want to explain it right now because it kinda sorta is reliant on your 4th ability, so let's rather discuss it after we're done with that. Ability number 3 is a very strong support tool in the form of Dispensary. When you tap the ability button, you will put down a Dispensary on the field, which will give you 1 out of 3 pickups in an interval of 2 seconds. First of all, it will give you an Empowered Health Orb that restores 100 health, then a Universal Ammo Pack that can refill every weapon category, even ARC guns, making it so that Protea can theoretically keep ARC guns active infinitely, and thirdly, a Normal Energy Orb, rinse and repeat. Overall, these pickups might not sound all that amazing compared to what other Warframes can give you. However, if you use the mod Equilibrium, which turns health pickups into energy, then you will see that Dispensary effectively solves your entire energy economy in an instant. Remember, those Empowered Health Orbs that it gives you give you 100 health, meaning with Equilibrium, that would be 110 energy. And as if that's not cool enough, there's also a certain chance to get extra energy pickups, scaling with your ability strength. In other words, if you have high ability strength, there's even a chance you're gonna get 2 of those Empowered Health Orbs at once, aka 220 energy. Now, there is also an augment for this skill called Repair Dispensary, which makes it that the Dispensary will start generating a 4th type of pickup, which, when used, will regenerate 20% of the health of your companion, as well as reduce their cooldown timer by 12 seconds if they are currently down. If you ask me, this can be a helpful augment, especially in higher level play if you run a setup or a synergy that really wants your companion to be active at any given time. But then again, we also have multiple mods that do the same thing and can help with that, which is why I personally never really use it, and I would say for like 95% of the player base, this one is probably not gonna be all too useful. And finally, let's also talk about ability number 4, Temporal Anchor, which happens to be a bit of a controversial one. First of all, what this ability basically does is a sort of time rewind similar to Tracer from Overwatch. When you tap the ability button, you will enter sort of quote-unquote recording mode, in which the game will record your current position and basically everything that you do. When the ability duration runs out, or you tap the ability button again manually before that, you will sort of go into replay mode, let's call it that, where essentially everything you just did in the recording mode will be played backwards, you will go back to the position that you started at, and all the ammo, energy, shields, health, combo counter, or everything that you lost during that time will be restored to where they were when you started the quote-unquote recording mode. In addition to that, while you are in the recording mode, there's a little number under your crosshair which records a percentage of the damage that you dealt throughout the recording mode, and that damage then will be dealt to all enemies in line of sight to you once the recording is over and you enter the replay mode. Now, you can also hold the ability button to cancel the recording and just continue playing as usual from the position that you're currently at. And there are a couple of other things with this ability. If you want, you can read it in the wiki. But to be 100% fair, at base, this ability isn't all that amazing, and most players usually subsume something else over it. However, all of this massively changed with the introduction of the Temporal Artillery augment, which is an augment not for your 4th, but for your 2nd ability, Blaze Artillery, because this now opens up a great synergy. If you use Temporal Artillery, then instead of being stationary on the field, your Blaze Artillery will float next to you while you are in the recording mode of your 4. This is very convenient because A, you can now have the artillery on the move, kinda like Zaku with their floating guns, and on top of that, it also removes the low duration of the Blaze Artillery because it will now stay active as long as your 4th is active. In order to balance that out, the damage multiplier of that Blaze Artillery is capped at 20 times, so it cannot go up infinitely anymore. In most situations though, and especially at base level Steel Path, round about enemy level 150, this 20 times damage multiplier is more than enough to take out basically everything in front of you. So yeah, if you rather want to have your Blaze Artillery on the go and not just have it stand around, then that is a service which is now provided by your 4. But not only is there the augment for your Blaze Artillery that interacts with the 4 also has its own augment called Temporal Erosion, and what that does is, while you are in the quote-unquote recording mode, every hit from your Blaze Artillery or from the slashes that your little grenade fan deals, the enemy hit will lose a portion of their armor. Now, while I think the Temporal Artillery for your 2 is actually a pretty darn decent and convenient augment to play, I'm not all that sure about Temporal Erosion for your 4. On the one hand, it is very cool to be able to remove enemy armor with this skill, but you gotta keep in mind the damage that your Blaze Artillery deals is already crazy high, so based on only the Blaze Artillery hits, enemies will most likely be dead before they have lost a decent amount of their armor anyway. So in that sense, Temporal Erosion only really makes sense if you spam your slash orbs all over the map constantly, because those get in hits quite frequently on all the enemies in their AoE and will trickle down their armor very quickly, but you really gotta decide for yourself if you like this very grenade spammy playstyle. If you only want to go for the artillery, then I would say the armor reduction is not really worth the mod slot. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be really nice because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support. Whew, now that was quite a lot to go over. However, before we get into the builds themselves, there is one more important mechanic that we need to talk about, and that would be Heat Inherit. When it comes to Heat Inherit and what that is and how it works, I already have an in-detail guide on that, so I'm gonna keep it short and to the point here. Basically, the thing is that a lot of abilities in the game can inflict heat status effects, just like Protea with her Blaze Artillery. The thing though is that these abilities are not directly moddable in the way that, for example, weapons would be. However, and this is a very weird interaction, if you inflict a heat status effect on an enemy with a weapon first, and then you hit the same enemy with an ability that inflicts heat status effects too, then the game will take some of the modifiers that you modded onto that weapon and somehow apply it to all the damage over time effects that came from the ability as well. And those modifiers are the heat damage bonus, the faction damage bonus, and the status duration. Now, what does this mean for us here? Well, we obviously can't mod heat damage, faction damage, and status duration directly onto the Blaze Artillery. However, if we put that on a weapon and then apply heat to an enemy with the weapon before we bring out the Blaze Artillery, then the Blaze Artillery hits will inherit those bonuses from the weapon, leading to overall ridiculously increased damage on the damage over time coming from the Blaze Artillery. Just a quick recommendation from my side here. I think the most convenient way to do this is to run the Sciotid as your secondary weapon because it has great grouping capabilities, and then use any Sentinel of your choice as a companion and give him the Tazikor as a weapon, which will then give a build similar to this one here so that your companion can do the heat application for you, meaning you don't have to do all of that yourself. All you need to do then is group up the enemies with the Sciotid, and at that point your companion will likely already have inflicted heat to them because companions are very quick with their lock-on, bring out the blaze artillery, and watch the world burn. Don't get me wrong here, this is not an obligatory playstyle, right? The damage of the blaze artillery is already ridiculously high, and in most situations you will not need heat inherit whatsoever to further buff up the damage. I just wanted to mention this interaction as an option if you really want to max out everything. But now let's finally get to the chapter that you've all been waiting for, and that would be the builds. In this video, I have a whopping 4 different builds prepared for you. First of all, a cheap beginner build using basic mods and low investment because Protea is accessible relatively early in the game, so I think that would be a good fit. Then we're gonna have the most common playstyle, which focuses on dealing as much damage as possible with your blaze artillery. And here I have 2 variations of the blaze artillery build, one for the stationary blaze artillery, and one if you use the augment to take it on the go. And then finally, I also have a very underrated build in my opinion, where we're gonna use the slash grenades to lock down the entire room and turn any stationary defense mission into an absolute breeze. But let's first of all start out with the beginner build, and I'm gonna keep this one relatively short because there's not much to say. This right here would be it. In the aura, you can use whatever you like. Put in whatever fits and whatever you have. Then in my opinion, 2 most important mods on her would be these here, Flow for more maximum energy, because Protea is a very energy spammy Warframe, and Equilibrium, because as I explained in the skills section, your Dispensary, as you can also see in this little trailer here, it drops a lot of big health orbs, and Equilibrium takes those 100 health that you would get from it and turns it into energy. Just as a little side note, my Equilibrium right here is of course maxed out, but if you're still newer in the game and you don't have 20,000 endo to do that, don't worry about it, you can always just put it to level 7 or 8, which is much more affordable and should get the job done too. For your survivability, all you really need is redirection for more shield capacity. Ideally with Protea, you should never actually get damage to your health because your shield orbs should keep your shield up at any point in time. And if you want to be extra safe, you can also use fast deflection, which further increases your shield recharge and shield recharge delay. This one though is a bit of an optional one. If you want to save on mod capacity, you can also just drop it out and not really lose anything. The rest of the build then is a healthy mix of strength, range, and duration. For Protea, ideally as much strength as you can afford, so if you have any other strength mods already unlocked, like for example Blind Rage or Transient Fortitude, just throw those on as well, it's gonna be a nice DPS increase. Oh yeah, and just by the way, please ignore my Eclipse subsumed over the 4 here, this one right here just had something to do with what I did in this loadout slot beforehand. So much for the beginner build, let's next talk about the most common playstyle, which would be the blaze artillery build, where, as I said, I have 2 variations for you, starting out with the stationary one. First of all, let's talk about helmet options, and for this build in specific, I think my general recommendation would be to subsume over your 4th ability. As for the stationary blaze artillery build, we don't really need the temporal anchor at all, and all the other skills are much more useful for this setup. As for which abilities to infuse, we have multiple options. Of course, if we wanted to be tankier, we can use Eclipse from Mirage because that gives us 75% damage reduction. Then, of course, we have Roar the Almighty, which not only increases upfront damage of the blaze artillery, but also the damage over time from the heat procs, because it's considered faction damage and therefore double dips for damage over time effects. This is, I think, a very strong contender and always a great option, so definitely feel free to put this on. Nourish, of course, always works too, but not really all that great on this example, and my personal favorite in this slot here would be Thorough Strike from Styanax because it synergizes very well with her playstyle, where you group up enemies in one blob and then you just cast this ability into the blob to instantly reduce all their armor to 0, so then the Blaze Artillery can hack them into pieces in absolutely no time. Doesn't have to be this one for you, but I just wanted to show you a couple of options. Now, when we're talking about the Archon shards, then things become quite interesting. We have a lot of options here and all of them are equally viable. First of all, given the fact that Protea is a very ability spammy frame, I think you need casting speed. I used 2 normal yellow ones for that casting speed. I think you could also get away with 1 Tau Forged, but I personally prefer the plus 50% from the 2 yellows. If you wanted to go all in, you could also even use 2 Tau Forged, but I think that might be a bit overkill. Up next, Protea is a Warframe who really wants to have a lot of different mods, so mod space is a bit of an issue, which is why I decided to outsource Flow and free up that mod slot to Blue Archon shards, giving me plus 150 maximum energy to a total of 400, which is not amazingly much, but it gets the job done. If you wanted to make some more space, you could also replace those 3 normal ones with 2 blue Tau Forged and have 1 more slot to spare for something else like more ability strength or duration, especially duration is always appreciated on Protea. But let's now talk about the build itself, and this right here would be it. Aura is free, use whatever you like. I went for Growing Power because more ability strength is more gooder. Same goes for the Exila slot. I do like Prime Sure-Footed, but hey, you use whatever you feel like. Now, first of all, for the build, we need Archon Vitality. Not really for the health, because, you know, we are a shield tank or shield gator, but for the substat that doubles or heat procs inflicted by abilities. I personally have a lot of formas on this Protea, so I can get away with a max rank Archon Vitality, but if you want to save up some mod space, you could also go and just use a rank 0 one, because we don't care about the health bonus, and the doubling of the heat procs will work with a rank 0 one exactly the same way. For survivability, we go with more shields from Prime Redirection, as well as adaptation, but if you wanted to be a bit riskier and play more into the shield gating rather than shield tanking, you could drop adaptation and replace it with literally anything else that you like. For the energy then, Equilibrium, that's really all we need in combination with a Dispensary. As I already explained with the beginner build, the supercharged health orbs that you get from it in combination with Equilibrium will give you all the energy that you need. Up next, we want to have a whole lot of ability strength with Blind Rage as well as Umbral Intensify to deal more damage with our Blaze Artillery, and combine that with High Duration 2 coming from Primed Continuity. Finally then, I added Stretch for a bit more range, just to make sure that the Blaze Artillery can really hit every single enemy in every corner on the map that it sees. But to be 100% fair, 43.5 meters might be a bit of an overkill, and you could get away with just 100% range and a 30 meter base range. That's already pretty good, so if you like, you can replace Stretch right here with anything of your choice. Now, let's next though look at the 2 arcane slots, because here is where it gets very interesting. In the first one, I use Arcane Concentration. This is one of the new arcanes that was introduced with the December update, and it is just absolutely perfect for Protea. It gives you 60% ability duration for 3 seconds after you cast a skill. And given how we spam skills all the time with her anyway, this buff is pretty easy to maintain, and it will make sure that your Blaze Artillery gets a lot more uptime, therefore higher multiplier, higher damage. However, if you don't like this restriction with a 3-second time frame, you could also go for Mold Efficiency. This is sort of the old option that we go on Protea, which gives you only 36% duration. However, you're probably going to have this one up constantly, so that's the convenience option, so to speak. And then in the second arcane slot, there is one option I want to mention before I explain the Arcane Ice Storm here, and that would be Arcane Expertise, which turns your ability strength modifiers into shield modifiers. This one can give you much more shields, and if you rather want to use another mod right here, you could drop Primed Redirection and use Arcane Expertise up here to also give you a lot of shields, just swap the arcane slot for the mod slot, so to speak. However, I personally used Arcane Ice Storm because this one is an excellent arcane that gives us more of the two very stats that Protea desperately needs: ability strength and even more duration. Now, the downside of Arcane Ice Storm has always been that it is a bit tedious to trigger because you have to freeze enemies yourself and you can't outsource this to companions. However, here we benefit from another new arcane that was introduced in the December update, and that goes on our melee, which would be Melee Kareen. If you roll, then enemies next to you will be instantly frozen. This can be used to very easily and conveniently stack up Arcane Ice Storm on your Warframe, and makes the whole thing much more viable on Protea than it was before. As for which melee to put it on or which melee build you need, it really doesn't matter. Just use any melee with an arcane slot, put the arcane in, and the rest really doesn't matter here. We don't use this melee on Protea whatsoever. Just use melee Kareen and you're gonna be fine. However, also here, I want to give you an alternative. If you don't like this whole rolling around melee Kareen freezing enemies thing, then you could go the easy and convenient way and just use Molt Augmented, which gives you plus 60% ability strength after you gain a couple of kills. You don't get more duration out of this, but it still massively increases your damage and all is fine. Now, just in case you're interested, let's also quickly go over my companion, which by the way will be the same for all the builds in this video. This right here is just a standard overall Diriga build. It's not specifically made for this Protea here, just, something that I use on many different setups. And then this right here is the Tazakor build that I previously showcased already, giving us heat for the automatic heat inherit if that is what we want to use, and corrosive to further reduce enemy armor if Diriga hits them with the Tazakor. Now, let's also quickly look at the weapons. As I previously mentioned, the Sciatid is the perfect secondary for Protea because it can be used to group up enemies to then let the Blaze Artillery blast into the blob, and this right here is the build that I personally use. You don't have to 100% copy this, alright? All you really need here is as much multi-shot as you can get away with, because the multi-shot sort of affects how many enemies you can group up. The rest here, you can really just leave all of that out. You don't even need to format it. Just use it for the grouping and you're alright. And then also I have another backup primary right here in the form of the Torrid Incarnon, which actually I'm not using to deal damage to the enemies, but instead I have a corrosive cold build here, the corrosion to further reduce enemy armor, so we deal more damage, and then the cold, if I don't want to roll around all the time, I can also use that one to freeze enemies and stack up Arcane Ice Storm. Also here, just an example build, you don't have to one-to-one copy it, but I find the Torrid Incarnon is a very convenient weapon option to support Protea in her Blaze Artillery playstyle. So yeah, this would be the build and the synergies for the stationary Blaze Artillery build, but as I said, I also have a second spin on this build, where you don't have the Blaze Artillery stationary, but use the augment, and this one looks a tiny little bit different. The biggest difference here is that we don't subsume over our fourth ability, because we need that ability to be able to use the augment for our second skill and bring the Blaze Artillery with us, so the 4 is off limits, which unfortunately means we either have to skip using a Helminth ability entirely, which is, by the way, perfectly fine. You don't have to use a Helminth skill. However, if you wanted to bring one, you have to put it over your 3. I know it stings because it's a great energy economy tool, but there is no other option. As for which Helminth ability to use, I would highly recommend Roar because the damage bonus to your Blaze Artillery becomes more important if the multiplier is stuck at 20 times, it gets capped when you bring it with you, so Roar is very much appreciated to deal more damage and sort of compensate for the multiplier not being able to stack. For the Archon Shards, everything I said before also applies here. You can do it like I did with the casting speed and maximum energy, but you can also go for more duration with the red ones, or if you like to and you have a corresponding primer, you could even use purple ones or orange ones to gain more ability damage. As for the loadout, everything is basically the same as before, no changes to the builds of the companion, the weapon choice, or whatever, and the Protea build also looks pretty darn similar. Only difference is that here we drop the stretch that we initially had for a bit of more range for the Temporal Artillery Augment, because really, we don't need more range on our Blaze Artillery, especially if we bring it with you, so if there's an enemy on the map further away, we can just jump over there and hit them anyway. Now, if you wanted to, you could also use the Temporal Erosion Augment, of course, but again, I don't think it's worth it if you just intend to use the Blaze Artillery by itself. If you go for Temporal Erosion, then you have to spam these slash orbs all across the map, because this is the way to reduce enemy armor very, very fast. This one is sort of like an optional thing. And now, last but definitely not least, let's also talk about the slash orb build, which always gets sort of shrugged under the rug. Most players underrate it because it doesn't deal the flashy big numbers that the Blaze Artillery does. But the utility that this one provides is insane. It lets you easily solo any type of stationary defense mission, even in Elite Archimedia. Now, also here, let's first talk about the helmet. Well, you have basically two options again. You can subsume over your fourth ability, because we don't really need it as we're not using the artillery augment from before. However, remember the augment for your fourth ability where you can use the slash orbs to reduce enemy armor? I think using this one specifically with this build that focuses on the slash orbs is a viable option. It's not going to be a game changer because most of the damage that you deal with this comes from the DOTs that ignore armor anyway, so it's really only the direct upfront damage that this one influences for you then, but I would say it is a viable option, and if you want to use this augment, then you have to keep the fourth ability and subsume over your 3. That's the question you have to answer. If you want to use the augment, subsume over the 3, if not, subsume over the 4. When it comes to which helmet ability to choose, there's really only one option in my opinion, and that would be Roar, because it not only increases the damage directly from the orbs, but also the slash DOT ticks, as it is considered faction damage and double dips on DOT. Since these orbs don't deal all that much damage at base, I think you really need Roar to get some decent numbers out of it. Archon Shards then, again, everything that I said before also applies here, just especially with this build. It is very, very, very ability spammy. You spend all your in-game time just spamming those orbs everywhere, so going for casting speed 50% or even more, I think is a must. Now, this right here would be the build, and it looks a little bit different than the other ones. Main difference here is that we focus on having much more range. The reason for that is we want to have more radius on those slash orbs so we can lock down more of an area in the room and hit more enemies, force them into stagger, all of that good stuff. So for the range, we go for overextended as well as stretch. Augur Reach, remember, we can't use that here because Augur mods destroy the shield gating invulnerability that Protea provides, so leave your fingers off of that. At the same time though, we also need high ability strength so that we're actually dealing some numbers with this, which means we need Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify, Transient Fortitude, and we're also going to talk about the Arcanes in a minute. For survivability, I went for only adaptation. You could also just use Primed Redirection without adaptation, just doesn't fit on this build here, or you just leave it out completely and rely on the shield gate. It's your personal choice. Then as always, Equilibrium for the energy, Prime Continuity for a bit of duration. These two up here don't really matter, use whatever you like, and let's talk about the Arcanes. Also here, I went for Arcane Ice Storm for 40% strength and duration. Everything that I said previously on the Blaze Artillery build also applies here with Arcane Ice Storm. And then in the second slot, I decided to go for Molt Augmented, because really, we don't need all that much duration on this build here, and more strength means more damage, and that is good. This way, as you can also see in the background right here, you can just spam your slash orbs all over the place, and enemies can't even walk through them, they can't even get in line of sight of the defense target. Just, maybe keep your eyes peeled for the occasional Eximus unit, because they don't get staggered as long as they have overguard, meaning you might want to snipe them with a weapon or something. And if you want a full 2026 tier list of all Warframes, then you can find that right here. Another massive shoutout to NeotsV, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkanio2, Skyla Bowser, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hound Tagas, Patrasader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Arwindai, Zengen, Quax, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, Happy New Year!